So I'd like to just welcome Frank. It's a real pleasure to have you here, and we're really looking forward to hearing all about the ACHIEVE trial.
Good afternoon, everyone, and I want to thank first Peter for inviting me back to talk to you, and thank you all for being here in person. It's always lovely being back in person for seminars as opposed to online when we can. So it's funny, I think I was last on this campus about 5 years ago. At that point, I was just presenting the beginning of the nidus of this trial that we're planning, and it's really nice coming full circle and now coming back and showing the results and what it means. So I'll begin this by saying this might be a, give me a second, I'm just going to click over again. This was a cover of the Lancet from last month. It was actually published earlier than that, but it came out in print last month, came out online 2 months ago or 3 months ago. And it reads here, based on the evidence from the ACHIEVE study, hearing loss might be a particularly important global public health target for dementia prevention efforts. So what I'll be really covering today is really the design of the trial, the results for what formed the basis of a relatively very, very strong statement from the Lancet on this exact topic. And before I begin, I'll also have to say I need to thank a lot of people. So the ACHIEVE trial represents really the collaborative work now over a decade of work that began back in 2014. It's involved 8 different universities across the United States. It's involved about $40 million in funding from the NIH government, or the NIH from the government to fund this trial. So really, fundamentally, I'm presenting on behalf of a much larger group. This represents only about probably a third of the people involved in this trial. All right. So what I'll cover today in the next about 40 minutes, I think I'm aiming for, is I'll briefly cover some background on hearing loss dementia, why this research happened, the study design methods around ACHIEVE, the evidence for hearing intervention target engagement. I'll go over what I mean by that a little later, the effects on the primary outcomes on global cognitive decline, some other exploratory outcomes looking at loneliness and social isolation, finally just a brief sort of summary and take on the results and what's coming next in the ACHIEVE trial. So background, what we studying and why. So probably many of you have seen this figure before. This came from the Lancet Commission on Dementia a few years ago. And they fundamentally did this study. It was a major meta-analysis of all the existing evidence to date looking at potential risk factors for dementia, mainly to help advise governments around the world about how do we prioritize risk factors to hopefully lower the number of people with dementia down the road. And what they identified in this study as well as a previous one is that hearing loss in mid or late life was single-handedly considered the single largest potentially modifiable risk factor for dementia, right? And the key word there is potentially. It's okay, I can do it too. The key word there is potentially, and the reason why they said potentially is because there are hypothesized mechanisms through which hearing loss could actually could directly increase dementia risk. The first idea is the idea of cognitive load. If the peripheral auditory system is constantly much more degraded signal to the brain, does the brain constantly have to reallocate brain resources to helping with the decoding of that auditory signal, and then come at the expense of other systems. So it's not so much hearing loss, I would say, causes dementia there, but hearing loss taps into the cognitive reserve that could have been used otherwise to buffer against other known pathological contributors to dementia, things like Alzheimer's disease pathology, microvascular disease, right? So we all know there's a buffer that somehow can buffer against the pathology before it presents phenotypically, right? The second idea, it sounds similar, but it's actually very, very different. It's the idea that hearing loss in some way, shape, or form can actually directly lead to accelerated brain atrophy and trophic effects on other pathologic brain changes. In that sense, auditory deprivation actually directly, I should say harms, but directly leads to brain structural effects in terms of brain volume loss, right? So that would actually imply that hearing loss actually does directly structurally affect the brain and actually could have a direct effect on cognitive decline dementia. And the third idea, it's going to be incredibly intuitive. It's the idea that hearing loss can contribute to social isolation, which in turn can affect our participation in cognitively stimulating activities, our ability to stay engaged with others, all of which we know is important for maintaining our cognitive health. Now, the key thing about these mechanisms is not that one's true, other ones are wrong. It's likely a combination of all three through which hearing loss could potentially directly increase dementia risk. Now, the reason why thinking about these mechanisms is important, though, is because it implies that there are these different mechanisms that may mediate effects of hearing loss and increasing risk of cognitive decline and dementia, that plausibly, that a hearing intervention, using a hearing aid well with adequate support service or using it appropriately, could actually possibly mitigate these effects and reduce the risk of cognitive decline dementia, right? Namely, when we use a hearing technologies appropriately and they're fit and adjusted well, we certainly hope we can reduce the cognitive load if we're providing a clear auditory signal. At the same time, we certainly hope providing increased auditory brain stimulation, right? And finally, the whole reason a lot of times we treat hearing loss, the most proximal effects is to hopefully improve communication, social engagement. So plausibly, hearing intervention could definitely mediate these affect these mediating pathways and reduce cognitive decline or dementia. Now, I say in theory though, because this question really remained unknown, right? The question, you can imagine, can't be answered through observational data, because you can imagine if you look at observational data from the community, people who have hearing loss who use hearing aids versus those who don't, they're really different. People who use hearing technologies, they essentially healthier, wealthier, better educated, right? As well as a range of other health factors. So if they have better cognitive results over time, is it from the fact that they got their hearing addressed, or is it from those factors that led them to get a hearing aid? And you can't disentangle that as much as we like to try to. It's really, really hard to. And people have tried. So just as recently as 8 months ago, a major meta-analysis published in JAMA Neurology, meta-analysis of all the existing observational studies to date, and they concluded, after adjusting for any type of potential confounders per se, that hearing aid use was still associated with about a 19% decreased hazard of long-term cognitive decline. But the key thing is this is still speculative. We think it makes sense, but there's never ever a previous randomized controlled trial that directly answer that question. You can imagine a randomized controlled trial, you can just vary one factor, whether they got hearing intervention or not, so you can actually disentangle whether hearing intervention actually leads to reduced cognitive decline dementia over time. So this was basically the basis of the ACHIEVE trial, is fundamentally asking a really, really basic question, namely, if you treat hearing loss per se, can we reduce cognitive decline over 3 years? So relatively, not long-term, but relatively short-term period for basically older adults with hearing loss without any substantial cognitive impairment basis. So otherwise, cognitively healthy older adults with hearing loss, can we actually reduce cognitive decline over time? So this is the basis of the ACHIEVE trial. The main focus, the main primary outcome, which I'll present today, is basically global cognitive decline. There are a lot of other areas we're measuring too in the ACHIEVE trial that have been measured essentially at the same time scale, which I'll go over in a bit. Looking at brain MRI structure, which we have time, I'll touch on. There were some of the results there at the very end. Also measures of mental health, well-being, depression, social isolation as well. Physical function, actually in terms of physical abilities, we can actually measure IADLs, ADLs in terms of activities of daily living. We actually measure actigraphy with a wrist-worn accelerometer once per year for a week. And then we also have healthcare use in terms of utilization of healthcare utilities, resources and expenses as well. Those are all these other areas which we're just beginning to analyze now. You'll see those trickle out over the next year as well. All right, so on to study design. So actually, how do we design the study? And this is probably what I was just presenting to you guys 5 years ago. We're actually just literally planning the study, so it's nice to come full circle again. The fundamental organization of ACHIEVE it involved 977 people who were recruited over roughly almost a 2-year time period, from 2018 to 2019. Nearly 1,000 people were recruited. They're all between 70 and 84 years old. They had untreated mild to moderate levels of hearing loss, basically pure to an average between 30 and 70. And they otherwise had essentially no substantial cognitive impairment at baseline. Now, importantly, what's really important to note is that these 977 people, they came from 2 distinct study populations. So one group of people came from an existing heart health study called the Atherosclerosis Risk and Community Studies, also called the ERIC study, called the ERIC group. These are people who were randomly sampled from the population 30 years ago and have been followed to the present day every few years in an ongoing longitudinal observational study looking at how midlife cardiovascular disease and risk factors lead to late life cardiovascular events. So there's just key thing is these people came from a random sample, have been followed for 30 years continuously, and they really represent sort of a random sample of the population as they were recruited many years ago. The other 3/4 of the study population came from new healthy community volunteers, people who literally respond to Facebook ads and advertisements in the papers and radio stations about a new study we're beginning to look at healthy aging and hearing and cognition. So people literally respond to ads and who came in interested in the study about healthy aging and cognition and hearing. So 2 different study groups formed the 977. Then between 2018 and 2019, they were obviously recruited. They were randomized. They either got hearing intervention, I'll go over what that means in a second, or a successful aging, I'll call it health education control intervention, that basically mimicked the hearing intervention in terms of exposure to study personnel. But obviously, one group got their hearing treated, the other group didn't. And I'll go over what those interventions mean in a second. They're then followed every 6 months with in-person visits, except during the pandemic, which I'll go over again a little later. every 6 months for 3 years, and the 3-year outcome, the primary outcome is cognitive decline. But again, we have all these other measures that we're measuring as well over the course of the study as well. All right, so I'll unpack this a little bit more in the next few slides. So the ACHIEVE study, interestingly enough, was based within the scientific and physical infrastructure of the ERIC study. So this is important. The ERIC study has been going on for 30 years, funded by the NIH. They had 4 existing study sites around the country with existing study personnel, existing protocols, existing literally the physical field site for where you recruit people and see people. And it's 4 different centers across the country. Minneapolis suburbs, Western Maryland near Johns Hopkins, Wake Forest University, and University of Mississippi. And again, the reason why building with an ERIC is very nice is that it is really hard setting up a new clinical trial. So the ability to nest within existing infrastructure, existing personnel, existing protocols for how you adjudicate dementia and measure cognition makes it much, much easier, right? So ACHIEVE then recruited from existing ERIC participants who are still eligible, as in based on age and other factors that are still eligible for the study. But we couldn't get everybody from ERIC just because there weren't enough people who were still alive or eligible in terms of the criteria. So we also recruited from de novo, which is healthy community volunteers. So again, you always hear me refer back to ERIC and de novo. Those are 2 different study populations that comprise this, N of 977. Just a rehash again. So the ACHIEVE study, it came from the ERIC cohort, right? People continuously followed random sample for 30 years versus de novo. All participants, when they join, they'd be informed that you'll be randomized either hearing intervention, which I'll go over in a second, versus the control. And after 3 years, you would also be offered the other one if you wanted as well, right? Key main inclusion criteria I mentioned, 70 to 84 years old. They all had to be essentially cognitively intact, more or less, based on no substantial cognitive impairment based on MMSE score, those education stratified. Untreated hearing loss, so basically a PTA between 30 and 70, with a speech scrim greater than 60%, so they're eligible for basic conventional amplification, and they had to be community dwelling. Oops. Took 2 slides, sorry. It's a little bouncy here. There we go. The intervention. So participants were randomized, and we did stratify randomization based on several factors, make sure there's an equal balance across severity of hearing loss, recruitment source, et cetera. The hearing intervention, this is really brief here. I'm happy to go over more. This is basically really best practice hearing rehabilitation. This was operationalized by the University of South Florida, Terry Chisholm and Vicky Sanchez. It's basically in the beginning of the study, after randomization, they had 4 sessions over about 3 months with a study audiologist, where they went over needs assessment, goal setting. They got fit for hearing aids. They got fit for any related technologies. If they need a TV streamer, if they need a remote mic, if there are a lot of conferences or meetings, for instance, and things like that. And then every 6 months thereafter, they saw the study audiologist again for a check-in and a booster session. That's one arm. The other arm basically was randomized, and they got a health education control intervention. This actually is a real program, by the way. It's called the 10 Keys Successful Aging. It's a structured program for how you educate older adults about key aging topics that are important for health: nutrition, vaccinations, cancer screenings, like that. So basically, they also had, at the beginning of the study, 4 sessions over the first 2 or 3 months, each being about an hour, where they went over one topic at each of these sessions, whether it was diet, vaccinations, cancer screening, like that. Then every 6 months thereafter, they also had a visit with a health educator, often a nurse, who then went over another topic among these 10 keys to successful aging, right? Key thing there is there's parallel there in terms of direct, how much exposure they had to study personnel is exactly the same. So one group got their hearing treated, other group necessarily did not necessarily. All right. Okay. Design study outcomes. So basically, again, a baseline visit. There might have been a screening visit first, then baseline assessments, and then every 6 months thereafter. The primary endpoint, again, is change from the baseline neurocognitive exam, which I'll go over in a second, to the year 3 in a global cognition standardized factor score. Go over what that means in a second. That's derived from this comprehensive neurocognitive battery, which I'll also go over in a second. Sorry, so it's constantly builds on itself as you go along. So I'm not going to leave you guys in the dust. There are also secondary cognitive outcomes, which are basically domain specific. So basically executive function, memory, and language, as opposed to global. And then we also have adjudicated incident cognitive impairment, which I'll define a little later as well. And there's a whole host of other outcomes, which you'll see a hint of today, but I can't go over all of them. But again, all the other measures we measured either every 6 months or every year: falls, physical function activity, healthcare costs, et cetera, et cetera. All right. The Achieve Neurocognitive Battery. This is a neurocognitive battery that's been used for over 15 years now. It was operationalized within ERIC. For those of you who are in the dementia space, this neurocognitive battery is operations by David Notman, Marilyn Albert, Tom Mosley, and a bunch of other people who are sort of these gurus of the dementia world who work within the ERIC study. It involves 10 different neurocognitive tests that sort of get at different domains of cognition. Important thing to note here is that 8 of these tests have no auditory stimuli at all. They have written instructions along with auditory stimuli, but not solely auditory stimuli. 2 of the 10 tests, digit span backwards and incidental learning, logical memory, do have an auditory only component. So what we do to ensure that people are actually understanding the spoken word is before we do neurocognitive at any visit, there's actually a test to verify speech understanding. They basically read 10 sentences from the hint sentence list, and we score them to make sure they're above a certain threshold to ensure that spoken word understanding is not compromising cognitive testing. And it really shouldn't. I'm looking at this mild to moderate hearing loss, face-to-face, quiet room, examiner at like 3 feet away. So spoken word shouldn't be, but we just verify just in case, make sure we're not seeing like an artifact here of someone not be able to hear the examiner, for instance. All right. How these cognitive tests are fundamentally analyzed is you have 10 different cognitive tests. From that, you can extract a factor score. For those who are familiar with factor scores, it's essentially you can think of it as a z-score, like a mean, but it's a little more sophisticated than that because you have differential item weighting. Some items can mean more than others, so you get a derived factor score. The factor scores are, the third point there, these are latent factors. It's standardized. So basically, they're normalized. Mean is 0. 1 would be 1 standard deviation away from the mean. So when you interpret this from baseline to year 3, you're interpreting standard deviation unit change. So if you change 0.5, it means you change 0.5 standard deviations from baseline. So that's how you interpret it, okay? You can draw one global cognitive factor score, or we can also have domain-specific cognition around language, executive functioning, and memory. And again, yeah, change over time is in standard deviation units relative to baseline. So everything's an SD unit, so it's easily interpretable. A secondary cognitive outcome too was also incident cognitive impairment. So we define this as a composite of 3 different things: adjudicated dementia based on in-person or phone-based evaluations in terms of how it was diagnosed per se. This is all done, obviously, this is done by a consensus group of usually one neurologist, one neuropsychologist who diagnoses this. So incident cognitive impairment was either adjudicated dementia, adjudicated MCI based only on in-person because it's a little squirrely doing that on the phone if you have to, or a 3-point drop from baseline in a 30-item MMC, or a phone-based equivalent, right? So not ideal for the phone-based equivalent, but don't forget we're in the middle of a pandemic, so we had to do some things virtually, which you'll see about in a second. The key thing is for 2 and 3 that we want to be sure we're getting cognitive impairment correctly. So you had to be 2 consecutive visits. You had to have that diagnosis to make sure it's not reversible. As you guys all know, MCI or mild impairment, you can sort of vacillate back and forth. Dementia, though, is very much an absorbing state, though. So we use a very, very conservative definition of what we mean by cognitive impairment. All right, COVID happened during this trial, right? And we got lucky. And what I mean by that hash area in the middle, that's March 2020 when everything hit the fan, as we all know. We fortunately, in this trial, everyone was enrolled and everyone had their full intervention before the pandemic hit. So then for the 1.5-year period, where we essentially, a little less than a 1.5-year period, 1 and 3-month period where we're not seeing anyone for in-person visits, those are only done by the phone, right? And convenient as we came out of that, we're able to bring back everyone back again for in-person visits. So everyone's baseline visit and the year 3 was fully done in person. In the intervening years, you can see how it affected people a little differently depending on when they were recruited, whether they had more in person or more virtual and things like that. But the key thing is baseline year 3, always in person. All right, statistical analysis. This gets a little in the weeds, but I'll go over it briefly and then we can touch on it more for anyone who may be more statistically oriented. So basically, the goal was estimate the effective assignment to hearing intervention versus control, right, on change in global cognition from baseline to year 3. These are mixed effects models that account for other baseline covariates like influence that could basically just add some error to the estimates. So we adjust for baseline hearing, recruitment source, field site, age, sex, and all that covariate by time interactions. For missing data, which I'll get to in a second, you did multiple imputation to impute in the missing year 3 cognitive data. Key thing, again, the main analysis, we only use the baseline and the year 3 in-person data. Only time we use year 1 or year 2 in-person scores was when someone died before year 3, and then you had to use that to estimate the model for that person, that trajectory. The main analysis basically looking at ERIC and de novo together, but we also pre-specified in our analysis that we would also replicate the primary analyses in each different group as well, because we realized that ERIC and de novo, they'd be very different, as you can imagine. So the analysis were replicated in ERIC versus de novo, as well as the main analysis, which had everybody in one cohort. There are a variety of other variations. You can do something called a per protocol or compliance after causal effect model. I'm not going to show those. They're very consistent with the main models I'm showing you as well today, but I can cover them if any of you are interested. All right, secondary analyses, same model for each individual cognitive domain, memory, executive function, language. And then incident cognitive parameters are basically hazard models. P of 0.5, as usual, is considered statistically significant. Sorry, bouncing here. All right, this just goes over really briefly. To recruit nearly 1,000 people, it took about almost almost 2 years. The blue line there is if we had recruited right on target. Our initial target size was 850. We actually are really proud of this. We were 2 weeks behind schedule hitting 850. And if any of you have done a clinical trial, you know recruitment is what always kills clinical trials. We were 2 weeks behind schedule. You can see we're actually on a vertical upslope there. So we actually got authorization from the NIA, the National Institute of Aging, to go a little bit longer. So that's why we hit 977 at the very, very end by keeping recruitment almost a little longer. To get to 1,000 people randomized, we had to screen nearly 3,000. So it's a huge amount of effort. You can see why this trial costs so much money. Because it takes a lot of effort and time to get 1,000 people into randomization. This is from the consort figure, so it's a little busy on the left and right, but you can trace through how many people dropped out over time, blah, 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 right? Key take home here, which I'm really proud of, after 3 years, 90% follow-up at year 3 through a pandemic for 70, 84-year-old adults. This is a testament, I gotta tell you more than anything else, to the study staff who are phenomenal, right? So we lost 10%. Many of those were from mortalities, unfortunately, within the midst of a pandemic. And some people actually just dropped out too for various reasons. That always happens, but 90% follow-up at 3 years. So we're imputing in ultimately the 10% missing data for the year 3 results. Some baseline characteristics. I'm going to show you the results here by ERIC and de novo. If you look at hearing intervention versus control, they're basically the same because it was randomized. But I just want to point out some difference between the ERIC cohort and the de novo, just show how they're different. And in general, what you'll see is the ERIC cohort had many more risk factors for cognitive decline de novo. Likely, again, it's not so much ERIC cohorts are more at risk, it's more the de novos are really healthy. I mean, these are people, if you respond to a Facebook ad when you're 84 years old, that's a good sign, right? So you'll see on average, the ERIC cohort versus de novo, they're slightly older. They're slightly more likely to be women, and that's because there was a fixed cohort over time, and there's been attrition over time, so there are more women than men over time. They're slightly more black race, mainly because the original ERIC cohort was fully 25% black when it was recruited. So as recruited from ERIC, there's more blacks and there's more blacks in the general population. But you see in general, the ERIC cohort slightly less educated, right? In terms of less in high school, slightly less income, right? And I should say slightly less. It's more that the de novos are really, really high because they're a very, very healthy aging cohort or a very healthy volunteer cohort. At the same time, you'll see for things like cardiovascular risk factors like diabetes, hypertension, again, slightly higher in ERIC versus de novo. Living alone, higher in ERIC versus de novo, right? What's interesting here too, if you look at our baseline cognitive scores among the mini-mental or any of the cognitive domains, you'll see again, the ERIC starts slightly lower than the mean versus de novo start slightly higher than the mean. Again, example here, the novos are the really, really healthy subpopulation more than anything else, right? So you're seeing that across all these different covariates at baseline. All right, so the first thing we want to look at is if hearing intervention presumptively can reduce cognitive decline, the first thing you got to show is the hearing intervention even working? Right? Are people even using the hearing aids? Is actually helping their communication as a basic proximal step before we even get to cognition? So this is what we want to first look at. So these are each histograms. You got to turn your head on your side, and it shows the reported hours of hearing aid use among the hearing intervention group at 6 months, 1, 2, and 3 years. So you see the median use at 6 months is about 10 hours. And over time, it trickles down a little bit, but even 3 years later, through a pandemic, we're still seeing a median use of 7 hours per day, which is really, really good if you compare it to no literature. There's obviously spreads to be able to really stop using hearing aids, only use it very incidentally, maybe for an hour a day. Other people use it all the time still, but the median is around 7, which is still really, really good. This, again, is a testament, I think, to the study audiologist, right? It's not just giving someone a technology. Every 6 months, they're going to be contact with audiologists to support the use, which is critical. I think that's why it's so high, is there's constant engagement with the audiologists to support technologies over time for an older adult population where technology is not necessarily the most facile thing they do. All right, in terms of, does hearing aid use actually trickle down to actually communicative function and performance? So this is something called the Hearing Handicap Inventory. It's a terrible name, but it's an older name, so it's called. Higher scores are worse. So basically it asks about questions like, do you struggle when you're group conversations? Do you feel embarrassed when you go out, right? So higher scores are worse. So what you see here, typically we say scores are above about 10, that's considered significant. On the left hand, what you're seeing here is among the control group that at baseline, they start around 14. And over 3 years, they actually get a little worse over time. Makes sense in a way. They're not getting their hearing actually addressed. In contrast, the hearing intervention group, you see is dramatic drop within 6 months, and it stays flat over the 3 years, right? If you use a cutoff of percent of people being greater than 10 versus less than 10, you see at baseline, again, in the blue, the control versus red, the hearing intervention group. At baseline, they're both about 70%, or basically had a significant hearing impairment. And over the next 3 years, they can drop down quickly for the hearing intervention group, stays high, even increase a little bit over time for the control group, right? So really nice indications now that it's actually having an effect. If we use a more squishy item at the very end too, we just ask, how is the hearing aid change your enjoyment of life? Or do you think hearing is worth the trouble? Again, these very sort of soft qualitative questions after 3 years through a pandemic, seeing overwhelmingly very, very favorable responses from people who got the hearing intervention. Again, I think a testament now, it's not to the technology as much as it is the support service has supported its use, right? So it really, it's against this general grain of thought, oh, I hate my hearing, it's stuck them in a drawer. I think the reason why we're seeing this difference here is because it was supported as opposed to someone selling a hearing aid and that person never seeing the person again, right? But again, really, really nice evidence of what we say target engagement. Now you can imagine that this is trickle out to actually reducing cognitive decline over time, right? So this is the summary figure for the analysis of the total cohort, combining the ERIC and de novos in the one. The way you interpret this on the left, this is in the control group for global cognition, right? They declined over 3 years by 0.202 standard deviation units. The hearing intervention declined about the same, right? So if you look at the forest plot, there's no effective hearing intervention. So this is a little discouraging, but you'll see where we're in a second, right? But on face value, in the total cohort, no effective hearing intervention on reducing cognitive decline. If you look within the 3 cognitive domains, basically the same thing too. Maybe memory, there might be a signal there, but doesn't look great. Now, the reason why I'm still smiling though, and this you saw the result on the Lancet cover, is because I mentioned before, a pre-specified analysis was look at ERIC versus de novo separately because they'd be really, really different cohorts. And I think you'll see this immediately. If you look at ERIC versus de novo, what you see in the ERIC cohort, you're seeing over 3 years a 48% reduction in cognitive decline. So the ERIC cohort, the controls decline by 0.4 standard deviations, almost a half SEU. That's a lot of cognitive change, actually. 0.5 is considered really meaningful. This is just short of that within 3 years. Versus the intervention, 0.21. That's a 48% reduction. You see that carried out among all 3 cognitive domains, basically seeing the same trend. Strongest for language, actually, as well. So this is language production, naming animals, naming letters, or words that begin with certain letters, right? So this is language production, not perception, right? We're seeing that well. And then if you look at the de novos, there appears to be no effect. So what gives? And what gives is this, which we sort of anticipated if we had thought about this really well years ago, is that if you look at the rate among controls in ERIC versus de novo, you see the ERIC cohort had basically almost a 3-fold faster rate of cognitive decline, right? So if you look at this risk factor, we knew they were more at risk, and you're seeing that borne out in the 3-year cognitive change, right? So they're changing 0.4 standard deviations versus only 0.151 de novos. Again, the de novos being really, really healthy. So one interpretation for why we're not seeing any effective hearing intervention in this group is that there was nothing to slow down. If you're only declining a little bit over time, there's not much effect a hearing intervention can have in slowing them down really anymore because you're not declining. In contrast for ERIC, which had a much steeper rate of cognitive change over 3 years, that's where you're seeing a significant effect of hearing intervention, right? If we move on to another secondary outcome, looking at incident cognitive impairment, you're seeing a same direction of signal, but nothing significant, which is probably not surprising. This is pretty hard endpoint for cognitive impairment. You're talking about a healthy cohort of 3 years. You're not seeing much cognitive impairment at 3 years later in terms of actually dementia rates, right? But you'll notice, though, among ERIC and de novo, though, you're seeing more cognitive impairment in ERIC than de novo, which makes sense. To look at whether or not this trickles out to rates, reducing rates of dementia over time, which take more time, basically, though. All right. So brief summary of the cognitive results so far. So in the total combined cohort, you're not seeing an effect in the ERIC and de novo. When you look at them separately as predefined, these study populations are really different. You're seeing really strong effects in the ERIC, 48% predict. This is a lot, by the way. So this was presented. We broke these results at the Alzheimer's meeting in July in Amsterdam. So these are, if you compare it to drug studies, this is a very, very substantial reduction in cognitive decline. And we're seeing that within 3 years. No effect observed in de novo, but the key thing there, though, is that you have a really slow rate of cognitive change in healthy de novos. You really can't see any further reduction of that within just 3 years, right? Just put that in perspective, the annual rate of cognitive change in de novos was 0.05 standard deviation. So it would take 10 years to change half SD unit versus essentially almost 3 times higher in ERIC, right? And this is consistent with what you see in the literature reported between what's considered a slow versus a moderate rate of cognitive decline. And again, why are we seeing the slow cognitive decline in the de novos? One of the main arguments is that these are really healthy volunteers. I mean, you're seeing 84-year-olds respond to Facebook ads. It's usually a very, very good sign. Versus ERIC really represented more of a random sample population. Actually, it was a random sample population over 30 years ago, been followed to the present day. So very, very different study population for how you recruit people. Limitations, as always. So one key thing is the effects of hearing intervention on that de novo group, as well as on rates of cognitive impairment, namely dementia. You're going to need to follow beyond 3 years. We can't say that in 3 years or not. We're going to need more time. There's always an argument made that control participants, they're doing more poorly because some of the tests have only auditory stimuli. We don't quite buy it for various reasons. I told you how we verify speech understanding is face-to-face. I'll tell you one of the things, too, is that the strongest domain where you saw reduction in cognitive was actually the language domain. The language domain has no auditory test. It's all auditory production, right? So it's very consistent that it's not being confounded by spoken word understanding. As you can imagine, too, the participants in study staff, we couldn't mask them, right? They could tell whether they got hearing aids or not. The study staff could see whether someone was using a hearing aid or not, too, as well. So it couldn't be masked for obvious reasons. So other health outcomes, I'll touch on this really, really briefly. So loneliness, social isolation, consider that proximal, maybe to cognitive change. We looked at very quickly. So the UCLA loneliness scale, some may have heard this before, it's a 20-item scale. Higher scores are indicative of greater loneliness, right? So 20 to 34, no low loneliness, et cetera, et cetera. This was administered, again, annually. So we're looking, again, from baseline to year 3 difference. So what you hear is again, seeing a very, very clear signal. These are small effects, but they're significant, right? So in the control group over 3 years, loneliness increasing by about 0.4 points roughly. In intervention group, you're basically saying flat, right? So again, the modest, I'll say effect sizes, but all going in the right direction. You're seeing as a total cohort, you're seeing in ERIC, wider confidence intervals, ERIC's a smaller cohort, and seeing it very clearly in de novos as well. This is loneliness, so basically reducing essentially loneliness progression over 3 years. If we look at social networks, this basically looks at basically social network size, basically the total number of people someone reporting having contact with, I think, in the last 2 weeks, versus social network diversity, number of social roles. You saw your spouse, you saw your son, you saw your neighbor, things like that. Higher scores here are better. So you want to see greater social networks, ideally, for most people. What you see for social network size, seeing the same thing. A signal, again, modestly small, but hearing intervention basically leading to preservation, so less decline over 3 years in terms of the social network size. You see, again, ERIC de novo, same trend, wider confidence intervals, you combine them and you see a statistically significant effect. And then if you look at social network diversity, again, same thing as well. So very clear signals across these proximal measures of the effects of hearing intervention on these outcomes. All right, so a summary and some concluding points. So I think one nice thing to always point out is that over 3 years, there was very high adherence and there was overall very high satisfaction with hearing intervention. I think that's really important to note. And I think, again, that's a testament to essentially the audiologist. This was every 6-month visits, someone supporting the use of the technology, which is critical. For proximal measures, we're seeing very clear positive effects across ERIC and de novo for communication impairment, self-reported communication impairment, loneliness, social network size, and diversity, right? We're seeing that trickle out over 3 years to very strong effects on essentially nearly 50% reduction on 3-year global cognitive decline in ERIC, but not in de novo, with again noting in the de novo group, they really had no cognitive change over 3 years. So it's gonna be hard to detect really any slowing, I think, within 3 years. And the key inference here, which you saw reflected on the cover of the Lancet paper, was that hearing intervention may reduce cognitive change within 3 years for populations older adults at increased risk for cognitive decline, right? For populations at decreased risk, you just can't see it within 3 years. That's a key thing, right? Some implications. So these findings, they're broadly supportive of the original 2020 Lancet Commission on Dementia report, as well as our current U.S. national plan to address Alzheimer's disease, for basically recommending that hearing loss has to be incorporated into national dementia prevention strategies. There are a lot of strategies for national dementia prevention, looking at other risk factors, but hearing loss has to be incorporated in that. And the reason for that, fundamentally, as you guys all know, is hearing loss is really common. So this is majority of older adults who are about preventing cognitive decline. They have some degree of hearing loss. At the same time, hearing interventions, they are widely underutilized by any stretch. These interventions are fundamentally without any medical risk. I mean, zero medical risk with using a hearing aid. They can already, we know now, improve self-perceived communication, loneliness, and oh yeah, for the subset at increased risk within 3 years already, you can see basically a halving in the rate of cognitive decline. For people at lower risk, I think we're going to see it as well, but it's just going to take longer than 3 years of follow-up because they need to begin declining before we can see effects of hearing intervention on slowing said decline. 3 main government actions for it really apply to really any country generically, but can be tailored specific to any given country, is that you fundamentally have to have third-party insurance coverage of hearing testing so people can be aware of hearing, and also for ideally hearing intervention. Now, the key thing there, come up this morning, is that for coverage policies, you have to distinguish between coverage of the technology versus coverage of the services. They're 2 completely distinct components. I guarantee we have taken any decent hearing aid, but if you took away the audiologist, you would not have gotten the results, right? But you could take any decent hearing aid, apply an audiologist to it, and I think you would have gotten very similar effects. The audiology, what drives engage uptake over the 3 years of the study. And unfortunately, it's probably many of you realize, though, insurance coverage policy for hearing care around the world usually does not distinguish between the 2. And then in that sense, it does not incentivize continued supportive service over time. So that's critical. That's a critical point for how it's reimbursed, shapes incentives. Along those lines too, I think government action, you clearly need regulations from development of OTC hearing aid market across all markets to lower cost. Maybe you realize there are 5 companies that essentially, shouldn't say control, but really dominate essentially 9% of the world's hearing aid market. So to get companies like Apple and Samsung and Bose innovating in that space, you have to have a regulatory model that allows for those companies to enter the market smoothly. That doesn't happen in most countries. The US market just changed a year ago tomorrow, it just changed. So you're seeing that develop right now in the States with a regulated OTC model, and you can Google it, but you'll see the companies entering the field are going to be pretty incredible over the next year or 2. It's going to take a little while to develop though. The third thing is fundamentally then you also have to drive public awareness of hearing, right? Everyone needs to know roughly what their hearing is. They need to know what the options and solutions are, but you foundationally have to drive that awareness, and that can only come through broad public awareness campaigns, either funded by the government or through industry potentially, but it needs to be done the right way. So what's next for Achieve is a few things. So determining the 3-year effects on other outcomes gathered in Achieve, namely brain MRI structure, and I'm happy to show this slide if we want in the next in discussion, as well as, let's say, other outcomes: depression, hospitalizations, physical activity. These analyses are actually all ongoing. The data is collected, the data is cleaned. We're literally every week now, we have weekly analytic call meetings. You'll see all these results across all those outcomes trickle over the next year. So 3-year effects of hearing intervention on healthcare costs, falls, activity, risk of disability. You'll see it all coming in the next year or 2 as well. Those are technically exploratory outcomes, I should say, though, but they're all being gathered in the same time frame. We clearly need longer-term follow-up of the entire cohort to observe for hearing intervention effects for those at decreased risk, basically the de novo cohort, as well as risk for basically things like dementia. So that study, fortunately, is funded too. So everyone in the Achieve trial now, after 3 years, is still being followed for minimally another 3 years, right? But I'll say that with a caveat, though, because The results can be a little harder to interpret in 6 years because don't forget, everyone who got randomized to control after 3 years, they also got the hearing intervention. I mean, you can't say you can't get any more, right? They're all gotten too. So what you're really looking for then at 6 years, you're looking for lag effects, is whether essentially earlier intervention, how much of a difference that makes over later intervention, right? So that's what we'll see at 6 years. So this 6-year follow-up study will be complete around 2026 for the long-term results as well. I will have a last couple slides. First thing is to acknowledge that this was a huge collaborative team effort across the U.S. 8 different universities, 60 different investigators and staff, with very generous funding from the NIH. So all the funding for this trial came from the NIH over many period of many years. The hearing aids were supposed to be donated by Sonova Phonak. This is important to mention because NIH, they're happy to usually fund a trial, but they usually don't want to fund devices or the drugs. They expect a company to sort of contribute. So fortunately, we're able to get Sonova interested early on, and under a MTA with Hopkins, they donated all the devices that are being used to date in the study. So they've been a great partner all along in terms of supporting, because it's a large donation of devices, you can imagine, for this many people. So they've been a great partner throughout as well. And I'll finish up there. Thanks, everyone.